When I'm writing something and want to use a syllogism as part of my argument, I got to be honest, I go straight to that chart of the 15 valid syllogistic forms. All right, I go to that chart and I make sure that my syllogism is valid, so that as long as my premises are true, then I know I have made a sound argument. But when you're having a conversation with somebody, it's sometimes more helpful to explain what's wrong with someone's argument by referring to the rules of validity. Let's just be honest. If you go up to somebody and say, well, your argument there isn't valid because it's a AAA 3. Most people are going to look at you a little crazy, right? They're not going to know what you're talking about. But if you can use the rules of validity to explain why someone's argument really doesn't hold up, that it isn't sound because of its validity, then you can have a more productive conversation. So here's our chart from the last video, and if you didn't get it copied before, you can pause the video and copy this one. But we're going to start off this time by looking at rules 3 and 4. Rule 3, the middle term must be distributed at least once. And if it's not, that's the fallacy of the undistributed middle. And 4, if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it must be distributed in the premises. And if it violates that rule, we call it the fallacy of the illicit minor or illicit major. And you may be wondering right away, well, what on earth does it mean for something to be distributed? And that's where we have to go next. So here we go. Kangaroo wants to make everything clear, and she says, let's make sure we know what some terms mean. Distributed means terms that represent all the members of their class or their category. And undistributed means terms that do not represent all the members of their class or their category. That's the definition of distributed and undistributed. And what we want to see is when the terms of the different propositions, the A, E, I, and O, are distributed and when they are undistributed. And for that, we've got another one of our helpful charts here, right? So we've got the 4 universal propositions, universal and particular propositions, 4 categorical propositions across the top. And we include that basic example for each one, right? All SSP, no SSP, some SSP, some SS not P. And then we've got a couple of rows for the subject and the predicate. And this is another one of these charts that's going to be absolute gold for you, okay? Because it just shows you immediately whether something is distributed or undistributed. So copy this chart, and then we're going to talk about it. So as I talk through this, you're going to want to look at that chart. Okay, so look at the universal A and the universal E propositions, right? All and no. I think it's pretty clear that the subjects of those propositions would be distributed because all is clearly talking about all the items in the category, and no is also talking about all the items in the category. And I think the particulars, I and O, I think that's also pretty clear that their subjects would be undistributed, since the word some is clearly not talking about all. All right? Now, you can see from the universal negative that the no is such a strong word that it carries all the way through to the predicate. And so the predicate of an E is also distributed. And likewise, the not, as it heads into the predicate of the O, is so strong. It makes the predicate of an O also distributed. But again, that chart is going to be the thing we want to reference as we go through these two rules, rules 3 and rule 4. So here's our fellow in blue, and he says, is this argument sound? All freshmen are logic students, and since all of Mr. Perkins' students are logic students, all of Mr. Perkins' students are freshmen. And the girl in gold says, well, the premises in conclusion are true, but is the syllogism valid? And the guy in green says it's not. He says the middle term, logic students, is the predicate of each premise, both of which are A propositions. This means that it is not distributed at all. right? And we have to have the middle term distributed at least once. And Logic Dragon comes in and explains that a little bit more. He says, remember, conversion does not work on an A proposition. Even though all freshmen are logic students, there may still be logic students in other grades as well. Likewise, we can't say that all logic students are Mr. Perkins students. Some, perhaps, even freshmen, could have a different teacher. This conclusion cannot follow from these premises in this order, because the syllogism commits the fallacy of the undistributed middle. Then Socrates comes in and he says, if we restate the major premise so that the middle term logic students is the subject, then it will be distributed, because the subject of an A proposition is always distributed. This gives us a valid AAA1 syllogism, and since the premises are true, the argument is sound. And notice we've just rearranged the words a little bit. All logic students are freshmen. All of Mr. Perkins students are logic students. Therefore, all of Mr. Perkins students are freshmen. Now, that's a really great example, because once again, it shows the importance of the arrangement of words. Truly, just changing a few words around can make something valid or invalid, and either make your argument sound or unsound. Now we want to talk about the other rule, which is that if a term is distributed in the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the premises as well. And if it's the predicate, the term is the predicate of the conclusion, it has to be distributed in the major premise. And if it's not, we call that the illicit major fallacy. And likewise, the subject of a conclusion has to be distributed. And you go back to where it comes from, the minor premise, and if we find that it's not distributed in the minor premise, then we've got the fallacy of the illicit minor. So our fellow in blue says, well, what about this argument? All people who believe in the resurrection of Jesus are disciples of Jesus. Since no atheists are people who believe in the resurrection of Jesus, it means that no atheists are disciples of Jesus. Girl in Gold says, once again, all that is true, but, and the guy in green says, yeah, well, once again, the syllogism is not valid. The major term, disciples of Jesus, is distributed in the predicate of the conclusion, but not in the predicate of the major premise. He has committed the fallacy of the illicit major. And Logic Dragon says, that's right, boys and girls. If we switch the subject and predicate of the first or major premise, however, we will get a perfectly valid AEE2 syllogism. Can you write the syllogism in this valid form in order to make a sound argument? See if you can do that. And Socrates says, well, of course they can, Mr. Logic Dragon. They will no doubt come up with, all disciples of Jesus are people who believe in his resurrection. No atheists are people who believe in his resurrection. Therefore, no atheists are disciples of Jesus. And that is a perfectly valid syllogism. Everything is true. We have a sound argument. And now I'm just going to bring the chart back up here so you can see where we're going. We're going to finish off with the last three rules. No conclusion can follow two negative premises. Obviously, that's the conclusion from negative premises. And that's going to be an easy one to spot, right? If you see a negative in both the premises, then you know it's not valid. Rule 6, if the premises are positive, the conclusion must be positive. Fallacy there, the negative conclusion from positive premises. And again, that's going to be very easy for you to recognize. And finally, number 7, if either premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. Otherwise, we've got the fallacy of positive conclusion after negative premise. So Socrates starts off this time and he says, can you spot the fallacy in this? No dogs are cats. No cats are fish. Therefore, no fish are dogs. girl in gold says, sure, both premises are negative, which means that you can't draw any conclusion from them. This is the fallacy of conclusion from negative premise. Now, if you stop and think about that, all the premises, or the two premises and the conclusion are true. All right, obviously no fish or dogs. But if you look carefully at how that's constructed, we've actually not gotten a conclusion that you can draw from those two premises. Okay, while everything may be true, it doesn't flow logically. That conclusion actually comes kind of out of nowhere. And that's why we say that it's invalid and would be an unsound argument. And Logic Dragon says, well, what about this one? Some people are people who like soft music. All people are people who like 80s music. Therefore, no people who like soft music are people who like 80s music. Of course, the 80s rocker in the corner is thinking, hey man, I dig soft rock too. But the fellow in blue is the one who really explains what's going on here. He says that is the fallacy of negative conclusion from positive premises. The conclusion may be true, but it doesn't follow from those premises. And then finally, we have little Kangaroo, and she says, we have time for one more. What's wrong here? She says, no clip art people are illustrations in Logic videos. Some clip art people are illustrations in PowerPoint. Therefore, some illustrations in PowerPoint are illustrations in Logic videos. And the guy in green says, well, the major premise is actually false, since I am a clip art person and I'm obviously in this Logic video. But as for validity, this syllogism commits the fallacy of a positive conclusion after a negative premise. And as I said, I think those last three rules are very, very easy to spot. You shouldn't have any trouble with those. So now you've got a set of rules that can really help you analyze an argument, help you see whether it's valid, and if not, can help you understand why and hopefully fix it. And that brings us to the end of evaluating validity.